So today, I know you've been talking a lot and there's a lot of engagement, so I hope to have a conversation. I feel obliged because they asked me to come to prepare, and being a little OCD, I've kind of probably over-prepared. So I'm going to walk through a bunch of stuff. If you want to ask a question, interrupt me. It's much more interesting, kind of the engagement, but there's a lot of stuff that I want to get through. So I'm going to try and do that quickly and thoughtfully, and then we'll kind of move from there into a conversation. That work for everybody? Truly don't worry about stopping me. So I live in Washington, D.C., and this is what it feels like most of the time. It is very difficult to get a lot done at the national level. It's unfortunate, and I think many of us are a little bit traumatized over the last probably 2 months particularly, right? But for folks that are interested in creating social change, policy is really important. And at the federal level, it's one of the big levers. And in education, it's increasingly become a big lever. So we're at a moment where the world is changing. At the federal level, it's hard to get stuff done. The good news is Americans don't just sit back and hang out. They actually leap into action. Many of you know Bruce Katz. He is one of the kind of great thinkers about what's going on in the country. I want to highlight, this is out of a book he just wrote called The Metropolitan Revolution. It's a great book if you haven't read it. You all are living it, and in this room you're proof of it. And look at this second sentence, which is my favorite piece of it. I don't have my glasses here, but it is, so leaders are jumping into action. It is a caring, pragmatic way of operating that puts place over party, collaboration over conflict, and evidence over dogma. It's an exciting time to be in the local community, more so now than ever. I think Kalamazoo Promise here and PromiseNet in general are really great examples of that. There are actually a bunch in the country. Many of you heard about Strive, rooted in Cincinnati, and has now gone national. Some of you may have heard about Ready by 21. It's an organization based out of the Forum for Youth Investment, similar kinds of work, this collective impact. And it goes on. Promise-built communities, Say Yes to Education, Harlem Children's Zone, extraordinary initiatives happening all over the country. Is this just coincidental, or is there something really important going on in the country? Is it not citizens organizing themselves, not waiting for the great hope to come from someplace else, but saying, you know, actually we have, within the context of our own community, the smarts and the resources to solve our problems. So it's an exciting time. One of the things that I think are, what are the characteristics of this leadership? And think about you all here and think about the work you're doing. It is multi-sector. One sector cannot handle this. Government can't do it alone. The private sector cannot do it alone, and the nonprofit sector can't do it alone. Rather, they are coming together and they are collaborating. And they're doing it in a profoundly important way, in a deeply bipartisan way. Last night I had, there he is, Kyle Moore. So I'm sitting there chatting with him, and so what are you? It's like a young guy chatting. He's like, oh, I'm mayor. You're mayor, how old are you? 32. I mean, what are you doing here? I'm looking for great ideas to bring back to my community of 40,000, Quincy, Indiana, and I'm trying to work with my community to think about how to mobilize. It was exactly this quote. Here's this guy reaching out to other communities, not going to Washington, and figuring out who's got it right, and I can learn from them, and I can take those ideas and I can work across my community. And what I'm most excited about that I think is new in our sector is we have more access to data and information. So we're making increasingly informed decisions about what are effective practice. So we're living in a very important moment, I think, of local community mobilization against really serious problems. So I want to focus in on public education as a case study for a couple of reasons. Because most of those collective movements actually have to have education be at the table in a front and center way in order for this collective work to happen. Why? Because it turns out leadership and young people are the pivot that enable communities to grow and change dynamically. So without a robust partnership with the Michaels of the world, you're dead on arrival. So what is public education's role? This is Dan Cardinali's take on it. I think there are two fundamental roles for public education. The first is we are a democracy. In order for this democracy to be successful, we need to have folks that can vote in an informed and deliberative way, can participate civically, particularly things like juries, and can be active citizens, conscious of their rights in both their obligations and their responsibilities, as well as what they can demand of the community around them. The second function is so that we have a robust workforce capable of driving this economy forward. And we have set up, historically, a pipeline. And increasingly, we're conscious of this cradle to career. You hear a great deal. And all of those collaborations I talk about the cradle to career. We know early childhood is incredibly important. We know we have to have a robust K through 12 system. And we know increasingly we have to have a post-secondary environment that enables people to participate in the workforce and become middle-class citizens. So that is what we see as the function of public education. Does anybody disagree with this point? Because I think this is the anchor of the rest of the conversation. Good. So the data bears this out. Increasingly, over the last 40 years, in order to get a job, you got to be educated. If you look on the far left side, the brown is a high school diploma or lower. 75% of the jobs in 1970s, you could function with a high school diploma or less. The blue is increased levels of post-secondary attainment, and you see a very clear trend. You don't need to be a rocket scientist, right? So simple fact, for that continuum to be effective, to really arrive citizens so they can be both deliberative citizens participating in middle-class existence, you got to have an education. Data's very clear on that. And then if you want to be in the middle class, you got to be educated. Those who are in the middle class have a higher degree. So those are the brutal facts. And I want to ground this back to the role of public education and to Michael's point. If we take seriously not just the public function of education to produce citizens who are capable of being self-sufficient economic beings, but that there is a justice, a social contract, that public education actually serves all young people equitably. There's very compelling data in our economy, in our country, that says no longer can you function with a high school diploma. You need to be college and career ready, able to participate in post-secondary attainment to secure middle-class existence. The data says that's really not up for debate. What post-secondary attainment is, I think we're still working out. But very, very clearly, the trend for the United States is an information-based economy that's going to require problem-solving folks. It also turns out that the data bears out, if you want for your child to have a livable wage, an annual income that can give them middle-class existence, high school dropout puts you basically in poverty. A high school degree basically keeps you just slightly above poverty. If you get an associate's degree, you earn about $37,000 annually. College degree puts you close to or in middle-class existence, and a higher degree, a master's or above, you actually can have a very solid middle-class existence. So all the data tells us this continuum has to be robust. We also know this continuum is really leaky. Lots of kids come out. Why is that? Because the continuum was basically, and you heard Michael talk about this, constructed for a set of assumptions about kids showing up to school of being middle-class kids. There are a set of supports and resources in their lives that when they walk through the door, they're ready to take advantage of the great teachers and principals and superintendents. The problem that we have is increasingly we live in a community, a country, where about a quarter of the young people showing up every day are poor. That means that 1 in 4, roughly, of the students showing up to a system that's supposed to get them to middle-class existence is set up, and there's a disconnect between what their needs are and what the demands are for them to be successful in school. So how do we think about resolving this? And what are the implications of this? The implications are, if you don't intervene and do something, there's a cumulative effect. Over time, young people show up less ready when they're young. They do less well as they progress. They eventually drop out, and they, as we see, don't participate in the economy with any kind of middle-class existence. And it also directly relates to college going. If you are poor, in the bottom quartile in the United States, you have a very low probability of going to college. You all know this. So it's not a good gig to be poor in America. The good news is public education is actually doing better and better in the United States. It is some of the best news we have going right now. We see the lowest dropout rates in many, many years for all subset populations. We see the highest graduation rates, and we have a terrific drop in the schools. I know many people hate this, the dropout factories. They're a proxy for schools that produce a disproportionate number of dropouts. Almost 1 million fewer young people are in those schools. There is great news. And I think we should stop and say, wow, there's a lot going on, but something really powerful is going on. So what are some of those trends? Now, my job is I sit looking across the country. We have 200 affiliates. So I look at macro trends. A lot of these things can be controversial. I realize this, but there is no doubt there's been a huge amount of investment in public education and thinking through how to improve it. So let me talk a little bit about how I see that history. Starting more than really in the beginning of the last administration, there was a very strong set of investments federally in No Child Left Behind. Whoop, I'm sorry. So much for memorizing. Let me just actually run through that real quick and go here. So there was a whole set of investments around No Child Left Behind. And there are 3 characteristics that I think are legacy that have really pushed our public education reform conversation forward. The first is around a centralization of accountability. Until No Child Left Behind, if you did not receive federal money, you were unfettered around accountability. With No Child Left Behind, the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, regardless of whether you're receiving federal dollars, you were held accountable nationally to showing your results. 2, those results had to be disaggregated by population. So you no longer, if you were in a very high-performing school that was predominantly upper middle class kids with a subset of poor kids, you couldn't hide your results in there. It actually got disaggregated, and you were held accountable to aggregating or to educating all of those subpopulations. And the third thing is, whether you like them or not, standardized tests rolled into the scene, and they were a proxy for accountability. With this administration, we saw a shift, right? First, race to the top and invest in innovation. There was no reauthorization of No Child Left Behind, and so the administration used a technique called waivers, which were effectively their policy agenda for the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind. You hear about it a lot. Teacher effectiveness rolled onto the scene, and all of the supports that's required there. You saw accountability systems rolling into the scene with data and longitudinal data by individual students. You saw a focus on turning around the 5% lowest performing schools. All of a sudden, the country now is waking up and saying, wow, we know more about the fact that schools are unevenly performing, and we have to create political will to do something about it. And during this administration, substantially more resources were poured into the sector. You have trends like charter schools. About 1.6 million charter schools in the last 20 years. I know we have a friend here who I think is leading a charter school. They vary widely. About 20% of them actually outperform the mainstream public schools. The rest either are about the same or less. But there is no doubt that things like KIPP and Aspire and IDEA charter schools have disproportionately contributed to the discourse about what effective public education can and should look like. It's inescapable. And the final thing that I am most excited about is this notion of individualized learning. And technology is enabling us to imagine that a child walking through the door at 5 years old can actually progress at his or her own pace based on competency and not seat time. That if you need a little extra reading help but you're great at math, you can move with your peers and you can move individually. There's an enormous opportunity, I think, for public education to embrace individual learners and unleash them into the world. So these are the macro trends that I see happening. I was going to make a point before that the most important thing happening in my mind in public education is this. There is education reform trends, which I just talked about. There is trends in youth development, meaning something is happening, and I'm going to talk a minute about this, that's creating a fundamentally different environment. So we've got these macro trends, and then we've got some really, really important insights about youth development. So I've been at this work probably 25 years in total in my life, and I come at it from the youth development and the community organizing side. And for the first time, data and research is now bearing out what practitioners know, that kids who are poor fundamentally are compromised in their ability to learn. Practitioners have known this for a long time. We've gotten caught up in the no excuses debate. People have said poverty has been an excuse. Other people have said you need to fix schools before you can fix poverty. Well, what we know about kids who are poor is they show up, and if they live in highly stressful environments that poverty routinely creates, you actually eventually chip down their ability to learn by cutting off their executive function and fill their head with a fight or flight kind of mentality. We also know that unstable attachments. Kids who are poor often live in immensely chaotic environments with a variety of adults who are often, for a variety of reasons, not stable partners with them in their growing. Turns out that relationships are a critical driver for young people to be able to manage the stress of just growing up. Add poverty onto that and no adult attachments, and you've got kids who are unable to self-regulate. So they show up to school a mess. And then you throw on that environments where they're hungry, where they're dodging bullets on the way to school, where there's a high preponderance of lead poisoning still, and asthma. And you've got a set of kids that are coming to school fundamentally compromised in their ability to learn. So the Michael and his teachers and all of the support staff in that building now are trying to manage not just driving increased test scores and unleash the imagination of going to college, but they've got all these other barriers that are showing up in school. There's some good news about youth development. We know that when you have a caring adult, you can actually stabilize a child. We have a fundamental saying at communities and schools: programs are not what transform kids, relationships are. When a young person knows that there is somebody, and better yet, a group of adults in their lives who are routinely stable in their lives, who will show up, make promises, and deliver on those promises, the stress in their life drops fundamentally. And they're capable of imagining beyond a fight or flight mentality. They're they develop the capacity to self-regulate. Throw on then this wonderful notion of brain plasticity. What does that mean? It means that kids are not done developing their brains until roughly 26. And actually the good news is we're never done. It just gets harder and harder. Fundamental to these adult caring relationships is the conviction that you, young person, regardless of who you are not destined because you've had an incarceration, or because you come from this poor environment, or because you've been almost kicked out of school. There is real data that says kids in a kind of stable, warm, trusting environment can begin to believe and imagine their world differently and actually get there. And then throw on the notion of high expectations. And I don't mean this just academically, although I do mean that, but also that you, regardless of your circumstances, should be expected to self-regulate, to be able to empathize with the people around you and manage conflict. That is actually an expectation of a child who's come from a difficult environment. How often do we who work among those who are poor excuse away bad behavior? And that is actually counterproductive once you've established a caring relationship and a set of expectations about your ability to grow. And you have to hold those high standards. And then environments are terribly important, right? They make a difference. When a kid shows up to school well-fed, in a safe environment, the stress level drops precipitously. Note, in my own experience, I have a fundamental principle that I believe in. The more chaotic the poverty environment that a young person is in, the more stable and rigid the structures need to be in order to stabilize them. Because the pressure against the system is substantial. So what does this all mean? We're at this very interesting moment. I mentioned earlier about the trends in education reform, and I talked about just now how youth development is beginning to converge. And the good news is we're seeing these fantastic learning environments. But there's something missing. How do you integrate these two dynamics in a way that supports the holistic development of children? Turns out that when you take school and community resources and you align and integrate them so that public education and holistic child development converge, it disproportionately is an effective strategy for poor kids. So the very thing Michael led with, that public education has a responsibility as an institution to create an equitable opportunity for all young people to become full citizens and economic beings. Turns out we actually know some of the levers to pull to make that happen. So Pam mentioned I'm on the board of Child Trends. It's one of my great fun jobs, part of my job. And through some negotiation, Michael Bloomberg, the mayor of New York, or just going out mayor of New York, has a huge foundation. They invested in Child Trends to do a deep dive about what we know in this blue band. What does the evidence tell us about what this integration can and should look like? And they've come up with a term. It is called integrated student supports. I'm going to walk you through what this is. It sounds like a fancy term, and all of the branding people say this is a horrible term, but it's actually definitionally correct. It is a school-based approach to promote student academic achievement and educational attainment. That coordinates seamlessly a set of wraparound services at multiple levels so that you target both school and community. This is the blue band. When you integrate student supports in a seamless way so that public education and holistic youth development seem to be one seamless whole, you get an amazing set of results, which I'll talk about in a second. So what are the elements of this? Are people bored? Is this too wonky? Is it good? Good? All right. So the first thing is needs assessment. What do we mean by that? It means that when Dan shows up at a doctor's office, I go through a whole checklist. How are you feeling? How's your heart? Are you taking any medicine? Are you allergic to anything? Tell me a little bit about your family history. There's a whole tailored approach to my health that my doctor then comes in and says, so you've got headaches. Are you wearing glasses? What's your stress level? How much caffeine are you drinking? And it comes up with a response based on what my needs are. Turns out, particularly for poor kids, there has to be a tailored kind of approach. And for poor schools, similarly. Every school is different. It has different leadership, it has different populations, and kids have unique stories. So there has to be a mechanism that is student-centric and school-centric to figure out what's going on. What are the assets in that community and in these kids, and what are the deficits? Coordination of services. So I've been doing this work a really long time. I've gone into hundreds and hundreds of schools, and I've heard principals say the same thing over and over again. You know, we actually have great school community partners. Problem is I have no idea who is in the building, when they're here, and which kids are getting services. So it turns out the coordination of those services so that public education, the principal and the teachers can take full advantage of them is a critical way to actually utilize those services and integrate them into the design of school, which leads me to the third point. So integration in two ways. Student supports should be woven into the design of school and should be woven into the design of an individualized student service plan. Data is very clear. When you do this, whole schools do better and individual students do better. Community partnerships, I talked about that. Let me just say this. Michael is an expert as a superintendent, and he hires extraordinary principals and teachers. They are deeply trained, and they should be unleashed to do their work. Yesterday, we met with 35, 40 community partners, all of whom are experts in mental health services, in dealing with homeless youth, in mentoring. They too should be fully utilized for their expertise. And the link between the experts who are educators and the experts in service delivery need to be brought together. Not one privileging the other, but the unique integration of those two. Data. So if anybody, any of my colleagues, I'm a total data geek, right? I like technology. So I have this very simple principle at the office that I say is you can't really change what you can't measure. We don't like it. They don't like it. And we start talking about loving kids into change. How do you measure love? Well, it turns out you can actually do that in some ways. So on the youth development side, we have to hold ourselves accountable to driving support to Michael, the teachers, and the principals. And it turns out when you anchor student supports in driving improved educational outcomes, you can measure it, and you can make really good choices. So using data to drive service delivery is fundamental in creating outcomes. We talked about this. There are multiple drivers, students, families. We just came from a session beforehand where how do you reach the opening line? Where's our friend from Lansing? Right here. You made the point that I thought was great. You said, we know that families are critical in order to get kids to imagine college, right? They can hear it from the world around them, but unless we're targeting families and supporting them in making that decision, we really are compromised in our ability to support students, right? Data bears that out. And then finally, I'm somewhat agnostic. You can do this work in schools and out of schools, but it has to be aligned with the aspirations of the school system. You have to hold yourselves accountable to improving academic achievement and educational attainment. So I'm going to finish up with two things. What do we know from the data? We know three things. You can improve attendance, which is a critical predictor of student success. You can actually drive academic achievement and improve graduation rates. So this integration, this school community partnership, has material benefits to getting kids over the finish line. The second thing we know is it's cost effective. So let me make a point here. If you take $2 million and pour it, so the local affiliate here's budget is about $2.7 million. So you could take $2.7 million, you could invest that into one school, and I guarantee you, unless you're an idiot, you can probably drive better outcomes. That is not the hard part. The hard part is to take that $27 million and spread that over 19 schools and still drive academic outcomes. Cost efficiency becomes incredibly important if you're looking for systemic solutions. Turns out this work, because it leverages existing high-quality community resources, provides a material benefit to the community. It is an economic development strategy, like public education. And then finally, and I'm just a wonk on this, implementation matters. The data from our own work and from the preponderance of evidence, doing this work at a high quality drives results. Doing this work mediocre makes no difference in kids' lives. Mentoring is the same way. If you don't hit a threshold of intensity over a 24-month period, you really make no difference and you potentially do damage to kids' lives. Implementation matters a great deal. So while this work is emerging and growing nationally, we need to learn from where we see effective practice. And there are great organizations. I think CIS is one of them. We are not alone. City Connects in Boston, Children's Aid in New York, and the list goes on and on. The work out of UCLA. There's just terrific organizations. And all this evidence is kind of converging on this knowledge. So at the end of the day, Michael gave me a charge, unknowingly. He said to me, Dan, if you're not talking about kids, then it's going to be boring. So thank God I had some wisdom ahead of time, and I wanted to end with this. If you go to changethepicture.org, we've just launched this website. It's really about kids' stories. You'll see 4 or 5 very different stories. I chose this story because it is actually a typical story. You know, you can do the high drama story of the kid that was in a gang and you saved him and amazing things happened. But the preponderance of kids are much like Hector you're about to see. And then I hope we have a terrific conversation.
Everyone has told me, if you want a good future, do well in school. I was having academic trouble. My grades were bad. I would get D's and C's.
I want my son to be successful in the life.
Sometimes I'd get mad because I'd blame the teachers, you gave me a D.
Do the right thing, Hector. He's so smart.
She would always get mad at me
Por tus grados.
because of my grades, and she would she didn't really know what was going on. Thanks to communities in schools, they directed me on the right path. Once I tried it, it was oh wow, this is easy.
Me ha ayudado a entenderte más.
They had helped her understand me more.
I'm a single mother, so it's hard for me. But I always say it's not impossible.
Communities and schools, changing the picture of education for over 1.2 million kids every year.
So I'd love to have a conversation. I don't know how much time we have.
20 minutes.
Oh, great. Okay. Thoughts, comments, disagree? Something wasn't clear? The blood sugar's dropping?
Yeah, sure. Tim Harrison from California, so we really know how to screw things up out there. I'm just curious if you can go back and just talk about the pipeline. And I don't know if this is a national conversation that you could expand on, but I work at a community college. I'm an administrator there, and the trend we're seeing is that, the constant conversations, they're just not prepared for the academic rigor. And I don't know if there's been any more conversation about changing the entry and exit points. For example, almost every high school is K-9 through 12. Has there been any more conversation looking at other models across the U.S. or across the international models, 13th grade, 14th grade, and a closer integration going back to that kind of system?
Yep. Great. So I know there are other people in the room that probably also have an opinion about this, and I really want to open this up to a conversation. So I'll say a couple of things that I'm observing. So I mentioned earlier this notion of competency-based as opposed to seat time. And I think that is a great threshold. So it's a way of rewarding kids who are in environments and they're not beholden to just the kind of pace that everyone's supposed to go at because you're 13 years old and you're learning, French history, whatever it is. But you're actually able to move with your interests and at your own pace. So kids could enter into post-secondary in a variety of ways. Number two, I think that a lot of the schools that we're working in, you're seeing community colleges doing the early matriculation. So you get juniors and seniors heading off to the community college to take classes because they're ready for it. And it opens up all sorts of horizons. And then, if you talk about online education, there are lots of free services that get kids up and running. MOOCs being one good example of that, as well as just classes outside of their traditional environment. So in Florida, you could hop on and accelerate your own learning to get credit recovery or jump ahead and get college credit. So those are the things I'm seeing. It doesn't address, I think, the issue that we talked about today, which is poverty, right? So poor kids are showing up to community colleges, often needing huge amounts of remediation. It's expensive for them, it disincentivizes them, it puts them in debt, and they feel like they put in time and they're not really getting at this college thing. So the national movement I see around that are the Common Core, right? College and career standards. Hugely controversial, there's enormous pushback, but at the end of the day, what it's basically saying is that if we hold ourselves to a framework of national accountability that has college and career readiness, when a child has finished the secondary education, she or he will be prepared to be able to transition into post-secondary. I think that's the vision. And it didn't come out of the administration, it came out of the governors and the chief state school officers. So that's rolling out. I know here in Michigan it's happening. There are places where you're getting, I think there are people from Arkansas, Alabama here, you know, huge, and in Michigan there was a big battle here. It's raging out across the country. Does anyone else want to add to this? Because I think this is a really important point. Yep. That's right. Yep. So you're spot on, and I think if you really dig below that, then what we're into is a set of institutions and the stakeholders that are running those institutions rightfully trying to figure out what to do. You know, they're employing lots of people, there's a set of training that's gone into the perpetuation of those institutions, and it is being disrupted all over the place. So I think it's going to take time, but I am hopeful, and you see school systems beginning to experiment, particularly in the alternative space, which always drives me crazy because those are the kids that are most at risk, but nevertheless, you get you open up the imagination for the larger community. Other comments, thoughts on this?
Just, Dan, for the benefit of the audience, I know that the integrated services model is held very closely by communities and schools. But if you're in a school district that doesn't have communities and schools, and maybe you're interested, but how do you access that? Do you have the capacity as the CEO of CIS to help all these communities here? I'm just wondering.
So now, that was a bit of a setup, right? Because she charged me not to talk about communities and schools, which I was delighted not to have to do. This is the first time probably in 2 years that I've actually had to give a talk that actually went beyond what CIS does specifically. What it forced me to do in the preparation of this talk was to actually look at what we know to be effective practice around school community partnering. So I'm going to say a couple of things about this. CIS right now has 200 affiliates, and we are very much focused on ensuring that all of our affiliates are as good as Pam and her team here. That is a weighty task, and we're focused primarily on that. So are there any, I think Pittsburgh has a CIS, right? Yep. Richmond does, right? Exactly. Who else is here? Anybody else has community schools in there? So 2 great ones, Pittsburgh and Richmond. Yeah, you guys have one of the best as well. Harold Fitcher is as good as it comes. They do. I don't know if they're partnering with them. Right, you do. It's been kind of up and down there, along with a lot of stuff in Detroit, but I think they're coming back. So the reason I put effective practice up there is so it gave you a schemata of what the evidence says you need to have in place. Let me throw out 2 insights around school community partnering. The first is kind of a diagnostic of why CIS has a network of nonprofits and not a big consultancy to school systems. It's an interesting question, right? Why wouldn't we just flip our network into consulting with all the big systems? It turns out we've had a set of experiments over the years where school systems have tried to adopt what CIS has learned and institutionalized it in the K through 12 system. Because of the pressure on the system to deliver academic outcomes, and because of the training that teachers and principals get around driving academic excellence, the student support strategy, let's say it's a professional in the building, tends to the first year do the CIS model, and the next year they're doing bus duty a little bit more and substitute teaching a little bit more in subjects they're not prepared for, and by the 3rd year they've been kind of ground out of what we know to be effective practice. So what's happened is we've created a parallel network that partners with the system. Pam and Michael ideally are community colleagues in the frame I put out there, that multi-sector leaders are coming together to solve the problem. So I would really encourage you, if there are like organizations, it can be a multi-service organization in your community. Some of the United Ways are getting involved in this work. There needs to be a set of institutions that are thinking about this. We're happy to have a conversation, and we nationally are exploring what our responsibility is to kind of generically get this information out there and provide training and technical assistance. Actually, Pam is coming to a meeting in a month that we're bringing a bunch of national experts a bunch of our own experts together to wrestle with what's our responsibility for sharing this kind of information out there. Yep, so working on it. Other thoughts or comments, questions, concerns? This is crap. Someone over here.
Thank you. I had a few questions. I had a few thoughts. Linda Lee Tarver with the Lansing Promise. And I was part of that facilitation of the earlier engaging parents and what have you, and students. A couple questions I had to hold while you were talking. The purpose of the promise and purpose of what you're doing, you mentioned it, but there is a character, faith, citizen responsibility component that you didn't necessarily hit on. Because education and providing good stewardship, good citizenship, and good moral values in the schools, how do we integrate that with the kids that we're dealing with? Because I know with dealing with poverty and all of that, there's another factor of ensuring that we are instilling our corporate or our national citizenship moral standards and values, that we have to have a baseline of those. How is that being integrated into the promise programs that we have? Because educating a child, and my mother said, you can be an educated fool, but how do we instill that into this program? And the other question that I had is that what do we do with the kids that have been left behind? When the Lansing Promise, we address GED completion, and we provide the promise for those who complete GED. But I did not hear that with other promise zones, that they are really going after those who've had some challenges and did not go the traditional route of high school graduation. And then are we also, and that's the second question, and the third one, are you keeping up? Okay, good. And the third one is that we do have kids who've been left behind. The investment in monies to educate children in Michigan, could be up to $10,000 a year or something like that. But it's $35,000 for a prisoner. And so we do know statistically that if you do not graduate, you're likely to go to prison. And then it's $35,000 a year investment into the prisoner versus a taxpayer paying $10,000 or more for the child. How do we get to communicate, or how do we get to make sure that we are investing the money up front versus the $35,000 on the back end for lack of education?
Okay, so let me see if I got these questions. The first is regarding the kind of character that's required to make education come alive for a kid. The second is around the social contract, around community actually owning the responsibility of. Yep, so opportunity youth, I call that the 16 to 24-year-old. And the third is around this notion of making the economic argument that says it's much better to invest in prevention than it is in intervention or incarceration. Okay. I don't know if I have the answer to any of them, although I will reflect on a number of them. So in terms of the character education, I think I get very nervous around that question because I think it can be, you can drive a lot of stuff that you have to be thoughtful about on that. So the way I think about it is around the notion of social and emotional learning. So what we want is citizens capable of deliberating, being empathetic, and self-regulating, right? So those are actually things you can teach, and there are a couple of modalities. The collaboration on academic, social, and emotional learning based in Chicago is piloting in 8 cities a curriculum-based delivery of these sets of skills that are actually using teachers to be able to build these competencies and link them to academic achievement, which they actually have evidence that they do. So that is a way I think about getting at this very issue, that schools can build the character, that is to say individuals who are capable of managing conflict, self-regulating, and being self-aware, and making informed decisions about who they want to be in the world, not in absence of the implications of that to other people. So that'd be the answer to your first question, I think. Yep. Right.
It needs to be a curriculum or some sort of integration where you're not looking at that as being something that is whatever.
Inevitable, or, by the time I'm 20, it's... So the second piece of that are a set of interventions that are targeted at high-risk populations. So in our own organization out of Austin, we developed what was called the XY Zone, which was a targeted strategy for men of color to build the competency for them to manage the set of pressures that are unique to being a high-risk male of color in those communities. It was an indigenous program in our network, and now it's being shared across our network after going through an evidence-based road. So there are these two sets of things going on. The second is around opportunity youth, and that I think goes a little bit to your question around community college, right? There's this group of about 7 million people, young people, between 16 and 24 that are not educated and not in the workforce. And are we committed to figuring out a set of strategies as a community to reach to those youth, create mechanisms for them to get their GED or some kind of equivalent, and then continue to support them through post-secondary attainment? Yesterday I had the really incredible privilege of going to the Kalamazoo Valley Community College, and we spent about 2.5 hours at their Student Support Center, which was a remarkable example of a community college recognizing that there are a set of strategies they can deploy that will enable their students to have a higher probability of being anchored in that institution and taking full advantage of the educational opportunity there. At the heart of what they kept saying over and over and over again is that until we can get these young people attached to the student body and to the institution through relationships, we really can't do much else. So they've built a whole set of strategies around engaging young people in a light touch way. So if there's an episodic problem, there's an adult able to respond to them. And then they had these mentors, which were what we would call intensive case interventions, right? So it was a very powerful example of what I talked about. Even through that young adult and early adult phase, caring adults turn out to be critically important to stabilizing that population. So the third question regarding the financial, so that's this. So I'd hate to get too wonky, and I know that the Johnson Institute is in here, Johnson & Johnson Institute is in here as well. CIS went after this directly. So we did this very deep dive around what it cost for us to be able to do our work, and what, using the evidence of our third-party evaluation, what value that produced to the community. It turns out that when you invest in communities and schools, $1, the data says nationally you produce $11 net present value back to the community. It takes about 9 years for that community to realize that investment, and then there are 40 years post that, it's a 53-year time period, that student is giving back to the community. And that is measuring not just the fact that they don't go to prison, which is incredibly expensive, but that they actually earn more money. They then pay taxes and consume and buy houses and cars, and they participate in the economy. So there's a growing body of evidence that measures the economic value. It's still very nascent, and I have to say there's a lot of controversy still in this. I can give you a lot more information about that, but if you want that offline. Great. Thoughts, comments, questions? Your blood sugar now, I'm sure, has hit the low, even with the caffeine. All right. So I want to say one last thing, and then I'm going to close out, which when I was preparing for this, I was kind of deeply moved. I got on a call with Janice and Pam, and I had this insight that you all are rewriting the social contract. And I just want to say, first of all, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to come here. Thank you for the opportunity to really wrestle with that issue. But it is extraordinary if you think about what you're doing. You are basically saying, we're going to no longer think about K through 12 as a public institution. That we as community leaders are now extending the expectation that young people have for themselves, that the community will support them through post-secondary attainment. That is a huge, huge statement, that now there are 30 communities wrestling with this across the country. And it is a big deal. So you all are kind of on the frontier of a kind of leadership that I think is really going to rewrite how public education is thought of. Probably we'll look back 20 years or 30 years from now and say, these folks got it and understood it and weren't waiting for the federal government or even state government to step in. They were just leaders who made it happen. So thank you all very much. Good luck with the rest of the conference.